and welcome everyone to KEI. I feel like I'm not really sure if I need this, but because we're such a small group here today, but I'm sure those of us who are listening on live stream will appreciate it for later. But I'm Kyle Ferrier. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs and a fellow here at KEI, and thank you all for coming. Today's program is part of our academic paper series. It's actually one of the last remaining of the year. We have a couple more lined up in the coming months, one in November on South Korea and 5G, and another in December on South Korea and the new Northern Policy. So please keep an eye out for those. Even before those for papers going out for next year, going out next week. So if you're interested in contributing or know someone who might be interested in contributing, I would encourage you to please forward that or take a look at that next week when it comes out. We'll be sending it out to our listserv as well as posting it on our website, and check it out on our social media as well. I recently had the good fortune to celebrate a work anniversary here a couple weeks ago, and I was thinking about on my time here and some of the things I really like doing. And at KEI, we are able to highlight topics in Washington that are sort of under-addressed, and we also provide a platform for up-and-coming young scholars who work on important issues that are also under-addressed. So I'm really pleased that we can combine two of my favorite things about working at KEI here today with today's program, and it really is looking at two very important distinctive things, the intersection of them as we talk about Korea. In the past few years, the Candlelight Movement in Korea showing itself as a democracy and sort of the demographic challenges that South Korea faces moving forward. And the intersection of those two really is migration and citizenship. And so that's what our program will be on today with our presenter, Darcie. Darcie Draught? Darcie Draught, sorry, is a PhD candidate, Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. She's also an advisor for public policy studies at Stratway's Group, a geopolitical risk and security consultancy. Darcie also spent some time here in DC at CFR, in Korea, IOM, and Yonsei University. Check out her full bio. We gave that when you came in, as well as the paper, which I would also highly encourage you to look over. I will turn things over now to Darcie to start us with our presentation. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Is this okay? So first of all, again, I want to thank Kyle and KEI for allowing the opportunity for talk about something that's really important to me as a researcher and as somebody who has lived in Korea and worked on Korean issues for over 10 years. This is something that I'm really passionate about, and I'm glad for the opportunity to put it in front of an audience in DC, because it doesn't always get the sort of depth of discussion, I think. And like Kyle said, right now, I think Korea has really proved itself to be such a resilient democracy despite being a comparatively young democracy. And it's really important to think about what democracy means in Korea and how what's going forward are going to be the issues that might come to the fore, and thinking about that. So my findings today, I'm actually really excited about this opportunity because I just came back from a 6-month dissertation research fellowship in South Korea funded by the Korea Foundation. And so I spent time there talking to policymakers, politicians, bureaucrats, NGO workers, migrants themselves about migration policy and how it's been discussed in South Korea. And so, this is part of a much larger project about citizenship in South Korea, demographics, migration patterns. And so I'm happy to discuss that more in our Q&A session. And I really would like to have a bit of time so that we can get into these. But for the purpose of my presentation right now, in the spirit of this year's academic paper series, Call for Papers, which wanted to look at democratic challenges after, or what democracy means after this really important Candlelight Movement a couple of years ago in South Korea. So I thought I could use my research that I had just done to shed light on how immigration policy or migration policy in South Korea and then the relating changing demographics relates to South Korean democracy. So, as I mentioned, South Korea's Candlelight Movement was really such a great moment when we consider Korea's democratic deepening. So it's reproved the resilience of institutions, like accountability, like ensuring the public could take its elected officials accountable for charges of corruption, for charges of elitism in politics. And it's particularly interesting because it's quite large scale. It grew from being a grassroots movement, and it comprised such a wide array of groups in South Korea, including NGOs, political parties, various workers groups, students, and it leveraged social media to bring all of these together and create real change in South Korea. So I think it's really important to think about something that this country did something that even in much older democracies haven't really or struggled to do. And so what I encourage us to think about is to think about how South Korea's democratic deepening kind of reflects a larger trend or patterns in social movements in South Korea. So that's kind of how I'm framing this in the paper. And so particular, I'm going to use this political jargon about critical junctures, thinking about moments in South Korean large-scale mobilization and what sort of issues tend to be much more nationally viable, and why different issues have not been quite as successful or have fallen off, I guess, a national or cross-interest agenda, a cross-group agenda. And so, historically in South Korea, the sort of critical junctures, especially when we think of the Candlelight Movement, have tended to focus on procedural aspects that focus on anti-corruption, elitism. We're seeing this again in South Korea right now with large-scale protests against officials in this current government. And I think that it kind of gets into the same way of thinking about democracy in South Korea. On the other hand, another measure of democratic deepening could be attention to minority groups or civil liberties, minority rights. There's different ways to parse it. And these social movements definitely exist in South Korea. In fact, they're quite vibrant when you think about protests for different minority groups, whether they're workers who have been very successful in creating reform for workers' rights. Also, women's groups are getting a lot more national attention. And right now, LGBTQ interest groups in South Korea are active and somewhat successful, I would say, in South Korea. But the problem is these kind of minority rights groups haven't been able to form the kinds of coalitions to push things about minority rights or civil liberties protections onto the national agenda. And I think, that speaks to different literature about social mobilization that I'm not going to get into here, that the conflicting interest groups agenda. But what I really want to do is kind of highlight how these patterns and how the historical large-scale social movements have treated diversity and minority groups in South Korea, and how those interests have historically been marginalized, even within civil society groups, large-scale civil society groups that want to account for change. So if we just kind of take a step back and kind of reflect on what does citizenship and social mobilization and action mean in South Korea? And I think, all of this comes down to thinking about South Korea's imagined community. And that's the Benedict Anderson term. I think Korea is a really great case study for thinking about how ethnicity and culture and democratic citizenship all come together to imagine what is Korea today. And this is where I'm going to tie in this increasing diversity in migrant policy. Yes, sorry. And so the sort of rhetoric about Korea's imagined community of ethnic homogeneity, common descent, cultural practices. This sort of rhetoric has been used to even transcend Korea's modern nation-state boundaries to engage other parts of ethnically Korean co-ethnics living in other countries, whether they're North Koreans, Koreans living in China, America, other Western countries. This imagined community has actually transcended state boundaries, but it all has been focused on being ethnically Korean. And yet right now, we're seeing that the racial and even cultural makeup in South Korea, even within, I guess, pure Koreans is really changing and diversifying. And so South Koreans, instead of looking like this, right, I just chose this as an archetypical image. This is from celebrating the 100th anniversary of, some people recognize as the 100th anniversary of Korea's independence from Japan, to something that's much more like this. All of these, I think, walking around Seoul, walking around the countryside, you'll see different pockets of Korean subculture. And so I chose this one. I have everything from K-pop, which is pretty typical of understanding Korea right now, but also this is a biracial, or a half Korean model who's now becoming more popular in South Korea, right? So it's changing racially, it's changing culturally, it's aging too, right? So minority group rights so all of these groups are looking different and acting different. And so in my paper, and what I want to do now is look at how the challenges of South Korea's democratic deepening, I want to put those in tandem with the past treatment of minority groups, whether they're full Korean minority groups or half Korean minority groups. These issues have proven to be politically sensitive and haven't gained a lot of national level change popularly. So as a case study of this, that I think is particularly salient, I'm going to look a little bit more in depth at migrant policies over the past 2 years, which have actually grown and institutionalized immensely. And then I hope that these sorts of discussions can bring to light some of the potential cracks in the Korean citizenship regimes, as well as the country's adherence to more liberal democratic ideals that it's seeking to work towards. So the first thing that I'm going to just take a brief step back, an overview, and I do this a little bit more in depth in the paper, is looking at certain critical junctures. I'm only going to look at 2 briefly in the interest of time, but how these critical junctures and the legacies of social mobilization they impart allow us to take a bit of a more holistic understanding to these 2 aspects, procedural and rights provisions or protections. These 2 dimensions of democracy could be measured. Excuse me. So as I mentioned, while the verdict is, in political science analysis is a bit still out on the repercussions of the Candlelight Movement, and there's a lot of moving parts, I think, in contemporary Korean politics, as this week's protests have shown. Certainly, the 2006 Candlelight Movement was hugely meaningful in terms of ensuring accountability of government officials, and the kinds of checks and balances have proven to be effective for citizenry to call upon its elected officials for change. So again, and I put up this graph that I pulled from Yanap News to show just how organized this movement was. Even though it was such a wide group of actors, they were all able to come together, to have regular protests, and then eventually that was acted upon. And the second one that I think is really important for thinking about the entire pattern of social mobilization in Korea, and this is certainly a part of a much longer movement of democratization in the authoritarian period, but the summer of 1989, the period of true regime change from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. And so the important things that I want to highlight in this one is that compared to earlier attempts in the 60s and 70s, which were sometimes violently stamped out through the coercive institutions of the autocratic government, was that during this time, it was large scale, it was centralized, and it served the majority of all of the subgroups' claims. It brought together Koreans across the socioeconomic spectrum, as well as intelligentsia, workers, farmers, all in this big movement. And importantly, the movement also exploited coalitions of NGOs, religious groups, especially the Christian church groups in South Korea, and youth organizations, many of whom were really at the front lines of protesting. Despite incorporating many of the Koreans' claims for political rights, the large-scale movement also, and there's other historical, sociological work on this, it strategically incorporated marginalized groups to empower the movement, but dispensing those smaller groups particular rights claims. And so the important groups like, especially women's groups, certain labor unions, particularly on the left, disability activists, all of these were incorporated in the movement, but the rights issue fell to the background, as it was really again, not to underplay the incredible efforts of a successful democratic movement, but the issue of minority rights fell out of this particular critical juncture of regime change mobilization in South Korea. So even since then, the smaller movements that we're even seeing today, things like women's rights or disability, groups that pay attention to homelessness in South Korea, all of these smaller groups that seek to expand civil and minority rights and protections have been subsumed into larger movements or fragmented and not able to kind of create a larger dialogue of what minority rights, what civil liberties mean in South Korea. So this pattern of treatment of marginalized groups seeking greater recognition, I think, is actually really important context for thinking about South Korea's democratic challenges, because it sets the frame for successful social movements and the language that's used, the successful language that's used to create national or challenge existing national policies. So, again, this is a question that South Korea needs to answer for itself, but South Korea professes to be a liberal democracy, one that upholds minority rights, not only free elections, separation of powers, rule of law, and we've seen that that's actually really successful. But if we think about the democratic challenges, and South Korea professes to be a country that is ascribed to liberal democracy, it's also interested in human rights, and civil liberties. And so these are things that have been on the margins of a lot of the social movements. Again, the protections of this increasingly large minority populations, and so it's both ethnic Koreans, full citizen Koreans, as well as the increasingly international makeup of South Korea, they're bubbling beneath the surface, but they're unable to put them on the national agenda. So to understand this better, let's look briefly at two contemporary social movements to show how the fragmented and contradictory claims prevent those claims from being turned into rights protection. So I think this one is actually really important, and it's repeatedly pushed on the agenda. But right now, South Korea doesn't have an anti-discrimination law. They brought it up in 2007, 2010, 2012, 2017, and this year again. Different advocacy groups and politicians, civil society activists, they've all put this in a very forward-leaning progressive agenda, but it hasn't been able to be passed. It's it's kind of in a sense, a catch-22, because it's actually sought to be extremely progressive, and that includes all sorts of minority groups, women. So it's preventing, or it's seeking to make illegal discrimination based on gender, religion, race, LGBTQ status, so sexual orientation, and other persons. And so it's actually seeking to be extremely comprehensive and extremely forward-thinking, in line with international norms and in line with the sorts of international agreements that South Korea has been a signatory to. But actually, it's this sweeping nature that has made it difficult to get past, because each of the groups that are covered tap into different, hesitance on certain subgroups in civil society. So in particular, conservative Christian groups in South Korea have made the issue of sexual orientation, they've brought that to the fore, and that being the calling upon politicians to swipe down this particular law because that goes against their beliefs. And that's been repeatedly the issue preventing it from getting passed. The second one that's particularly important when we think about migration and cultural difference in South Korea, and I'm sure everybody knows the ins and outs of this particular one, but the issue of last year's Yemeni asylum seekers gained international attention because Korea's actually, there was some visa, permissions that allowed the Yemenis to come to Korea in the first place. But for Korea's part, it actually was the first country in East Asia to not only be it was a signatory to the 1992 UN Convention on Refugee Rights, but Korea itself was the first country to act its own refugee law in 2002. So it suggests the national eagerness for an ambitious commitment to international norms as it pertains to migration and political persecution and humanitarian disasters. But the limitations of these aspirations to adopt international norms came to the fore last year when the Yemenis arrived in Jeju. Yemeni's arrival prompted a fragmented but strong popular backlash fueled by a lot of media hype in South Korea about these refugees being fake refugees. And some South Korean critics that I spoke with when I was doing my field work really told me that they felt like it highlighted a xenophobic fear of the Yemenis because they were Muslim, also based on their gender. They were male mostly, and their race. And so last year, over 700,000 South Koreans signed a petition to the Blue House to expel the Yemeni refugees. In fact, if you look at the track record, even though Korea has its own refugee policy, the proportion of asylum seekers who get refugee status is quite small, especially when compared to other nations that have refugee policies. So if you look historically from 1994 to June 2008, before the Yemeni issue gained traction, only 4% of asylum seekers in Korea were given refugee status. Although it should be also noted that another 7% were given humanitarian status, which allows them to stay, but under different conditions and with different protections. So what this shows is that left in the cracks of migrant governance, the asylum seekers are such a small group. It was about 550 of them. These asylum seekers weren't able to make successful claims for sojourn based on their human rights status. So now I'm going to turn a bit to talk about the main bulk of my research, which is about migration in South Korea. Korea's actually made such a vast changes over the past 15 years. There's been 3 successive 5-year plans for foreigners in South Korea, and immigration has risen relatively dramatically. So here's an increase. You can see it's about a 6-fold increase compared to the year 2000 to about 2015, 2018. It's actually gone from about 200,000 migrants or foreigners living in South Korea to 1.2 million. And so again, I want to clarify that when I say migrant, I'm actually using it to be conceptually analytically precise. I'm talking about anyone who comes to Korea with foreign nationality and stays for longer than 90 days. That's the kind of bare minimum definition of migrant. And so that allows us to kind of understand with more nuance and with more analytical precision, how does sending country, race, sojourn status, educational background, class, how do these all interact? That's a bit outside the scope of this paper. But when I say migrant, I mean anyone that comes to Korea. It's not, I think popularly it means a certain, So I'm just gonna leave it there. So this upward trajectory for people that study immigration or citizenship comparatively, it actually seems a bit puzzling. I think for many people that study Korea closely, it's actually really puzzling too, because to go back to that earlier image of Korea's imagined community, Korea has a really strong narrative of ethnic homogeneity. At the same time, it also has a very high state capacity to protect its borders. And of course, that's compounded by the fact it's a virtual island because it's cut off from the rest of the Asian continent. But starting in the mid-2000s, for a variety of interest reasons, the South Korean national government made huge progressive steps to open the country. And then it helped institutionalize, and in some cases, promote the integration of certain foreigners that live in South Korea. It's done so, and I do this by analyzing the documents and interviewing policymakers in South Korea. It's done so both in light of international norms, but also with a really practical consideration, the changing and quite dire demographic situation that Korea is finding itself in. Right now, and I'm sure many people in this room know, Korea has a decreasing birth rate and an aging population. And it's actually among one of the most aging societies in the world. Fertility declined from 6 children per woman in the 1960s during the developmental era to 1.2 children in 2005. So it's not able to replace its working age population. Demographers have predicted that Korea will face a 9% decline in the working age population in South Korea and a further decline of 26% of the working age population from 2030 to 2050 with these current trajectories. So the South Korean government has framed this demographic issue as an economic one and as one that can be solved by bringing more foreigners into the country to replace this declining working age population. So the migration solution in South Korea has sought to selectively import foreigners via strategic immigration policies. And it looks at different gaps in the working population as well as the social reproductive population to address these things. So even though this is steadily upward, I think another important way to think about this, especially when we look at this in terms of Korea's imagined community, is how this reflects, or how this corresponds to the total residential population in South Korea. It has grown dramatically in the past 15 years. And there's some indication that it might be leveling off, although there's only 3 years, not 2 years between the last two bars on my graph. But compared to the world average of 5% foreigners, it's still it's not quite yet a multicultural society as many other countries who have long received immigration are. I want to highlight, even though this is something that's relatively a small part of the South Korean populace, there's some new issues that are really coming to the fore when you think about Korea as a nation state and Korea as a democracy. First, although a lot of the foreigners historically have been co-ethnic returnees, so Koreans that have, for a variety of historical reasons, as well as actor-based reasons, found themselves in China, the West, Central Asia, and the former Soviet Union. Even though this group has historically been the largest portion of the foreign population, now the migrant population is actually much more diverse, not only in terms of race or ethnicity, but also in terms of religion, age, and gender. These are all much different than they were before. Class, educational backgrounds, it's actually much more diverse than before. At the same time, mainstream South Koreans' awareness of these populations has also increased in the past 10 years. So, if you look at some of the variety shows in South Korea now or popular media, you see it's actually much more diverse, and foreigners who speak, very fluent Korean are a much bigger part of the conversation than they had been even 10 years ago. Second, the foreigner population that's presented here does not capture the growing number of children from what are called colloquially as multicultural families, or 다문화 가족 children. Now they're being called children from an immigrant background. In the United States, we might say biracial children in some cases, or children with one immigrant parent. But it doesn't capture these because they're Korean citizens. And they're becoming an increasingly large portion of the population. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then third, the question of whether the guest worker program, which I think is also well known to many people who look at Korea's workforce, even though it's very institutionalized, there's growing recognition among policymakers that it's not a viable long-term solution. And there's a lot of things that are currently, meaning this year, on the policy debate agenda to revise or make up thinking about it as a more sustainable solution in tandem with Korea's status as a democracy. So one of the issues, I'll get into that a little bit more later. So I'm cognizant of time. I have about 10 or 15 more minutes. Okay. So to think about why South Korea's plans are a little bit different than other immigrant plans or foreigner plans is to look, I specialize in comparative politics. And so to think about how Korea is different from other cases with either longer or shorter terms of dealing with immigration. So some processes that deal with immigration, they can be top down, either through judicial review. A lot of the rights in Europe among European migrants have been handed down from the courts by executive order, which is something that the United States has done, or through IGO consultation, meaning in light of being a signatory to a certain convention, a country has adopted certain policies. Or they can also be bottom up. This is also something that the U.S. has experienced and has experienced. Migrant rights or advocacy organizations, or NGOs, have forced change either at the local or national levels and called upon its politicians to change migration policy. Or there's been a much broader constituent pressure on legislators. So this is kind of a broad overview about how migration policy change occurs. In South Korea, I'm just going to go over this really quickly. This is I go into this much more further detail in my my dissertation. But Korea's has actually been really different. And it's gone from being kind of an ad hoc governance, mostly with treating migrant labor at the kind of level of the firm, to a process of national negotiation. But right now, in my research with policymakers in South Korea, is that it's really quite bureaucratized, and that the national agencies and ministries have a lot of power to change either the rights or social welfare provisions by themselves. They get their budgets and they get their mandate from the National Assembly, but a lot of the decisions are made within the bureaucracies themselves. An outcome of this, and this happens during this middle period of national negotiation, was that migrants have been categorized both socially and in policy. And so migrants, again, to use that kind of analytically general term, is just about moving into a nation state. The categories of migrants are not natural. They're not natural phenomenon. Rather, they're created through social practices or policy. So in South Korea's case, 15 years ago, immigration was ad hoc. There were few pathways to long-term immigration or settlement. But now, through this process of bureaucratization, we have these new categories that have become both politically important and socially, people are socially aware about them. And so the first two, and I'll overview them briefly and why that matters. The first two, I think, are the most recognized in South Korea. And so that's the migrant labor, which is under the employment permit system, the EPS, EPS. And then the second one is the marriage migrants, or people who move to Korea with the purpose of marriage. And this is a very, proportionally, it's mostly women. It's about 80% of the marriage migrants are women, and a similar proportion come from China and Southeast Asia. And so usually when marriage migrant is discussed in policy circles and socially in South Korea, it's really talking about the intersection of all of these class, race, national sending country, backgrounds of these. And so you have these practical categories that are based on either the function, the sojourn status, the visa of the migrants, but then they've become, in practice, conflated with ideas about race, gender, sending country, class, family status, and occupation. As I mentioned before, ethnic Koreans have historically been a larger portion of the foreigners that are coming in South Korea. Oops, I lost my page. Here it is. And the labor migration programs really were much more ad hoc before and privileged co-ethnics. But then in 2003, this EPS system, the employment permit system, the government overhauled it, and it had this new system that was controlled at the national level, and it sought really to provide greater legal protection for these short-term migrants. So to give a little bit of what this means in South Korea, it's virtually a guest worker system. The labor visas are given in 1 year increments, extendable up to almost 5 years. And even though there's been a lot of, social reticence to the number of unskilled or low-skilled foreigners coming into the country, one way the government has sought to alleviate it is by employing co-ethnics or Joseonjok coming from China to assuage both government and popular concerns about integration. Integration being one of the biggest concerns, both popularly and among policymakers. So for the past 10 years, between 40 and 50% of labor migrants have been Joseonjok. So even though so this is a really big, diverse group of foreigners who relate to this imagined community in different ways, right? And there's some tensions there that we can talk about more, I think, in our Q&A. And then the second group that I think really bears mentioning, and it's really important when we think about the changing cultural and, in fact, racial or ethnic makeup of South Korea, are the international marriage trends. So, you can see that marriage as a whole, this blue line is total number of marriages in a year, is tapering. It's pretty consistent. And the red line is the number of marriage migrants, people coming to Korea on a marriage visa. Since the mid-2000s, it was these matchmaking, in a sense, was conducted through private companies. And they include things like meetups in the home country to kind of help ensure, open conversation and integration long-term, counseling for the legal processes for immigrating. And then the South Korean government has also provided integration programming for the marriage migrants and their children. While comparatively smaller to the larger migrant population in South Korea, the South Korean government provides special pathways for acquiring legal citizenship for marriage migrants, as well for these foreign spouses. And then based on this idea that they're new residents and new members of the larger Korean family. And then also, importantly, that they're going to be having children that will also be not only status citizens in South Korea, but full members of Korean society, working in Korea, living in Korea, contributing to Korean culture. And as of this year, the number of children from these international marriages is 1 million. So that's 1 in 50 Korean school children have one immigrant parent. So it's not an insignificant number. It's also interesting to think about because of the increasing trends, and when this first became a real social phenomenon, a lot of these children are now going to college, serving in the military, starting the workforce, and they're facing, this is based on my interviews with people, with policymakers who work more directly with these children, they're facing some difficulty integrating into Korean institutions like workplaces, like the army, or like their military service. And so there's some gaps that still haven't been closed, particularly as these children come of age. I'm going to skip this for now, just in the interest of time. I think that thinking about why bureaucracy control and presidential politics, which kind of set the agenda and the national agenda, have an important effect on it. But I really want to highlight, or I'll wrap up here, but kind of call to why this is important for South Korean democracy. Oh, these are some pictures that I took during my field work of the multicultural support centers. So these are serving specifically those marriage migrants and their children. There's also centers that serve labor migrants or really any migrant that's in South Korea. And then there's also the Seoul city has global centers in each of its districts to provide multilingual services and startup advice, actually legal and space to have startup enterprises. So there's a lot of opportunities here. At the same time, the kind of rights protection component is something that really hasn't hit the national agenda. And I think that that's important for us to think about, especially when we think about Korea as a increasingly multicultural society. And I say that with a grain of salt. Korea has this new term. It's called damunwa. I'm sure most of the people in this room are knowledgeable about it. But it was a neologism. It didn't exist before, and it was kind of created backwards from from the English word multicultural. And it was Korea recognizing that it needed to reconsider its discourse about the imagined community now that it has different kinds of effects of globalization, not only migration, but also new businesses that are working in South Korea, the Korean wave. All of this, I think, can be put to this larger discussion of where Korea stands in the world, and where is this imagined community going. So this idea of damunwa really came to the fore in 2006. At that time, President Roh Moo-hyun said that it was, quote unquote, irreversible that South Korea had already transitioned to a multiracial, multicultural society. That's actually really amazing considering at that time, think of my bar graph before, it was less than 1% of the population were foreigners at that time. So the national government was trying to be very forward-leaning in thinking about how difference can be understood in South Korea. And I know that at that time, President Roh saw linkages between migrants and other minority groups with the sorts of minority groups that he fought for earlier. And so that's something that he wanted to put on the national agenda. at the same time, Damunwa now has become really a specific term to mean multicultural families. So specifically one Korean with one foreigner and their children. And so it's actually become more of a descriptive category in an exclusive category rather than when we use the word in English of multicultural. It's actually more about cultural diversity. And so now there is some discussion of what cultural diversity means for South Korea. And again, I mean that even among, quote unquote, pure Koreans, I think younger Koreans now are interacting with their country and their fellow countrymen in different ways than earlier generations for a variety of reasons. So all of that being said, multiculturalism as a worldwide is kind of now understood as maybe not the best concept or policy mandate. So in 2010, German Prime Minister Angela Merkel famously said that multiculturalism had utterly failed and that immigrants needed to do more to integrate into their host society. So this sort of sentiment about the failure of multiculturalism has been picked up by some pockets of the policy community in South Korea to say, maybe we need to rethink how we're interacting with new members of our society, both from other countries and within. What I really think this does then is it draws into sharper relief conversations about belonging in South Korea and the conversations about who can be protected in South Korea. Right now, South Korean society has proven that it's kind of shied away from legal or political categories for minorities. And even the South Korean official foreigner plans have downplayed racial and ethnocultural differences. So the words like even multicultural is now the damunwa 가족 is being less used, instead to talk about immigrant backgrounds, to kind of downplay the racial difference, even though it is a huge part of the social experience of these groups in South Korea. Another issue. So what this shows is that more than a liberal norm laggard, I think a lot of people would say, oh, Korea's just catching up to this idea that we need to be accepting of foreigners. I think that that's actually missing this larger historical trajectory, both of how minority groups have been treated and how Koreans themselves, both policymakers and popularly, understand its own country and its population. It's not really about being pro-immigrant or anti-immigrant. Generally, the South Korean public is actually pretty reticent toward opening to foreigners, or there's an ambiguity about it, an ambivalence toward it. They're largely invisible to most South Koreans' daily lives. But some colleagues of mine did some survey research and found that about 60% of South Koreans that they surveyed were accepting of a multicultural future for South Korea. And so I think that there's a willingness to be more open about difference in South Korea. But it's unsure how that's going to come into play for the country as a democracy. So thinking forward, the question of these civil rights or minority group rights is one that the South Korean populace, of course, is going to have to discuss for itself. But the fact that marginalized populations are gaining new and expanded avenues through both bureaucracies and through social movements, new avenues for voice and protests, is and will continue to be part of South Korea's democratic future, particularly as South Korea's millennials, or whatever the group after millennials are, enter the decision-making positions in the near future, both as part of the voting public and as well as the leadership of the country. As I've mentioned, South Korea's demography is already changing. It's not going to be reversible at this point. But while minority rights, again, I just want to reiterate, this is one case of minority rights claims in South Korea. It really needs to, these groups, new alliances, in order to push on the national agenda, I think there's a lot of potential for new alliances to be made for a greater claims for rights protection in South Korea going forward. So I'll stop there, and I hope we can get in some Q&A discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. There's a lot to unpack there. Yes, but I just want to take it back a little bit further. You said you were specializing in comparative policies. And I know you were more focused on the immigration part, but you talked a lot about democracy and the movement from procedural democracy and liberal democracy. In the United States, we profess ourselves to be a liberal democracy. I mean, there are a lot of countries that profess to be liberal democracies. And I'm just wondering, to contextualize, at what point, I mean, is South Korea there? Is there a definite line they have to cross, or how do we contextualize it more broadly, maybe in a comparative sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I'm an academic and I try to be analytically precise. I'm also an interested member of the public. So I have two different answers, but I'm going to give the first because I actually think it's really important when we talk about democracy analytically. And I think this has policy implications, is that I think each country is on its own path. This sounds like a very diplomatic answer, but I think the idea of liberal democracy is really an ideal. And it's really about the terms on which the state-society relation is drawn. In South Korea, that trajectory has been different than in other countries because of its developmental period. It's, as I highlighted, the transformation into a democracy. So to think comparatively, I mean, if your question is what does a liberal democracy look like? I mean, I don't think a pure liberal democracy exists, partly because I'm a bit sociological, but I think it intersects with things like race, gender, religion, and many of those things are falling out of the cracks. But for South Korea's case, it's when I think that the fact that there's not an anti-discrimination law is, I think, one of the biggest impediments to liberal rights in South Korea. I think that there's kind of politician room to debate what does that mean for South Korea. But analytically, I think the biggest thing would be to protect individuals based on discrimination in a wide variety of the sorts of kind of backgrounds or statuses that I mentioned before: gender, religion, race. I think really that's the biggest impediment.
Yeah. You were right when you said this is just one case study. There's a lot of different case studies. When you're going through gender, religion, race, you can think about all these things, all these issues we've been hearing about in South Korea. But I want to take another step back, and we talked a lot about, again, you talked a lot about migrants, migration, race, ethnicity, Joseonjok. You didn't really get into. You talked a little bit about it in your paper, and I was just wondering if you could tease it out a little bit more about the role they play or they don't play, how they're not the Joseonjok, but even someone a little bit closer, the North Korean migrant immigrants who come from North Korea, and to what extent they're considered part of this, not part of this. How does that dynamic play? I mean, it's a very unique situation to South Korea.
Yeah. So I think actually it's really, and this is something that I'm writing a book basically. And so I wanted to kind of tease out some of these new ideas. And so I actually think it's really important to think about how Koreans interact with its own diaspora as part of this return migration, as part of migration policy. And so that's something that isn't always done when considering migration policy in South Korea. But South Korea has actually had a much longer history with migration than since the 2000s. That's really only been this national foreigner plans. Korea has actually engaged with its diaspora population since independence from Japan, since the division of the peninsula, really. And it's engaged, particularly because it has a special category for North Koreans. And there's some national strategy reasons for doing so. It's been talking about bureaucratization. It's actually, it's dealt with in a very separate branch of the government. But some of those social integration programs were used to benchmark for these children from a multicultural background. And so it's actually been much bigger part of that process of policy learning. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yeah. I have a couple more questions, but I think I'm going to stop there and turn things over to the audience. I think we have a couple of mics floating around. We do. So if you please raise your hand and state your affiliation. I'll get a mic directed to you, so we'll go to Florence in the back first.
Okay, Florence Lowley, Global America Business Institute. You touched briefly about aging society and the liberalizing immigration policy may help with economic development. But it obviously is going to help, but United States is known for immigration society, and yet U.S. is aging fast. And by year 2035, there will be people over 65 will overcome those under 18. So even with the immigration policy, migrant policy, or whatever policy, you really cannot help with demographic changes. So just if you had looked at not just the migrant policy, but other ways of how social policies that Korea is implementing and looking forward in this policy.
Daniel Worth from the National Committee on North Korea. Thanks for a great presentation today, Darcie, and for sharing your research with us. You ended your presentation with a reference to South Korean millennials and post-millennials and how things might change as they gain positions of power and influence in South Korean society. So I'm curious, what are the generational differences in attitudes towards issues like migration, towards minority rights? Is there a large difference between the millennial and post-millennial generation and older generations?
I'll take one more.
Thanks.
I'll go without the microphone. Polo, thanks very much for presenting today. That's very, very interesting. I'll just throw out a few thoughts that came to mind. I'm always interested in what you take away from this. What's the practical aspect? What's the application of what you found for governments? Question about imagined community. Why not community? Why imagined community?
Oh, okay.
Another one is the tragedy that happened in September, where the 42-year-old mother and 6-year-old son were discovered. Where does that fit into your findings and your research?
Great, yeah, those are great questions. Okay, all of these are really great questions. Let me try to tackle them as best as possible. I'll work backwards, actually. I think it's funny when people try to do that. So I'll work backwards. First, I used the word imagined community. I borrowed that from he's a historian, I think, Benedict Anderson. So I use this term imagined community because it really refers to this discrepancy between how Korea rhetorically has seen itself historically and then how it has been. So, if you think about Korea since the division of the peninsula, it's actually, even South Korea has been a diverse country, right? Even there's political divisions, there's economic divisions and disenfranchised groups in South Korea. And yet the imagined community has been one of development. It's been very focused on the middle class development. It has a very strong normative ideal of a family unit that's affected, how family reproduction has occurred, how education has occurred. So, achieving high education, which is partly why South Korea is finding a workforce imbalance anyway. And so I use the word imagined community to say that right now we're seeing that this beautiful ideal, and there's other work that talks about how this ideal was used during the developmental era to spur the rapid development that counts for, the miracle on the Han. But right now, this idea of an imagined community, every country has its imagined community, but right now we're seeing kind of the idea that, well, what's Korea's new imagined community? It's about the ideals to which it seeks to strive right now. And so I think to get into this, to link it to the question about millennials a bit, millennials as a whole are, again, it's not part of my research, it's kind of secondary research, but South Korean millennials as a whole, similar to millennials I think anywhere, is that they're a bit more individualistic. And so we're seeing that in terms of the decreasing, the increasing age of marriage and the declining rate of marriage in South Korea. So there's more Koreans who are choosing to live alone, especially young women. That's becoming a new social force in South Korea. They're much more socially progressive, even though fiscally so, maybe less than their counterparts in Europe or America or something like that. Definitely more so than neighboring Japan. Japan, a lot of people who study comparative immigration national identity do compare Korea and Japan because they have similar political economic structures and ideas about national identity. So I don't want to leave that one hanging, but particularly for Korea-focused individuals. But, they are a bit more quote-unquote progressive on these issues, with the caveat being, so a few years ago, there was some public polling done by the Asan Institute. They have a pretty good public polling shop, and they asked who is supportive of multiculturalism or migrants in South Korea. And the group that they found, Kim Ji-yoon was the author of the project. The portion that she found most surprising, because kind of it confronted popular assumptions about who would be most willing to open to foreigners, but were women in their 30s, because they saw migrants as being competitors for jobs. Her analysis was that women are increasingly finding it difficult to sustain lasting careers in South Korea. This relates to it's called an M-shaped workforce participation. So women in South Korea, as in other countries as well, they enter the workforce in their 20s, early 30s, and then they drop out of the workforce to raise children. And there's a lot of kind of business culture reasons for doing so, as well as family pressures. Again, this is outside the scope of my research. So her analysis was that because women are facing a hard time getting jobs, they're seeing migrants as a threat. So I'll put that one. The issue of the North Korean woman and the policy about North Koreans, I actually think it relates to this question of imagined community as well, in a sense, because, and to Kyle's earlier question about the role of North Korean policy, or policies toward North Koreans living in South Korea, because there's been this decades-long integration programming, and some of the researchers that I spoke to in South Korea said that it's been fairly unchanged, meaning some people can fall through the cracks. At the same time, there are certain assumptions about what North Koreans need that shows that maybe there's still some things that they need that they aren't getting from this social programming. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that that I didn't know before was that the centers, the Hanawan centers, are staffed by people who majored in social welfare. They're but not in North Korea issues specifically. So there may be, she suggested that there might be some gap in how people assume, right, and based on this idea of North Korean being our brethren and what they need to come to our society. And then some of the practical follow-ups, in particular in this case, need to happen either through centers, but also in the South Korean public, right? A lot of the media coverage about this woman and her child was that her neighborhood just didn't know. Right. And so I think it relates to this idea of who North Koreans are in South Korea once they get to South Korea. And then the question about demography change. If you look worldwide, developed countries, OECD top countries, they're mostly facing a declining population, especially in the workforce. So this is something that Korea's another developed country with a declining birth rate, and that's something that's not necessarily unique to Korea. The point that I wanted to make was that the Korean government it's shifted from being a country of emigration to trying to be one of immigration, and it's done so to frame it as a demographic solution. So whether that's actually the case, and it's going to be proved the case, that's obviously yet to be seen, because it's talking about 2050, right? And as you pointed out, countries of immigration like the United States, this is also happening in Northern Europe. It's a trend in Northern Europe, and they've been having immigration for decades, for centuries, and they're facing similar issues. So you're right. It actually suggests that immigration isn't the solution. I think the important question is, Korean government is framing it as a solution, but just like you said, you have this aging population that really is actually falling through the cracks. Elderly poverty in South Korea is very high. And so there's other social policies that need to be enacted to get to the issue of, I'm linking these all together, to get to the issue of other kind of actionable things. The aging population is going to be a serious issue of South Korea because of changing family structures, who is assisting elderly, and the idea that these populations are falling through the cracks too. So the imagined community of who takes care of whom, who's part of the society, is really a critical juncture, a critical moment of rethinking how our social welfare provisions are being provided and by whom in South Korea.
That was very impressive. Are there any additional questions? We have time for another round. Yes.
Hi, my name is Hyun Lee. I'm a Washington Fellow student, yes, from ASEAN Institute, and thank you for your speech. I was very I think it was very impressive to expect the hope the democracy to solve the immigration problems, but as you see the recent Korea situation, there is a huge conflict between men and women. Even the young generations, they're fighting so serious to each other. And there is a huge conflict between the LGBT and anti-LGBT. Yes, so I think it is very, in my perspective, I think it is very hard to expect the young generation to solve the immigration problems and other conflicts. So what do you think in this situation? Is there any breakthrough to solve these problems in the young generations?
Hi, Nicholas Simasevich, PhD student, PhD candidate at Catholic University. In your conversations, Darcie, where does kind of at least from us in the United States, the public and big kind of stories like the Yemen cases or some of these other cases kind of come into the conversation versus, at least for us in the United States, kind of the softer or the more quieter ones like the model or the student, like the kids growing up as have one immigrant family and they're in the school, kind of that sort of dynamic and how people in South Korea are thinking about these issues. So the kind of, I guess, what the public cases versus those kind of other cases that they have, and how does that impact their thinking on these issues? I guess in general, the South Korean public, and then maybe even in your conversation with the policymakers.
Hello, my name is Britt Robinson. I am a MA student at George Washington University doing Asian gender policy and security. So I have two questions for you. The first one, in the United States, we see a lot of these minority issues brought to the forefront of conversations in the public through celebrities. In your research, have you looked at all as a model for South Korea? Could the celebrities there start taking a position on these issues and bring it to the forefront? And then my second question is, your numbers looking at the foreign bride marriages, does that take into account human trafficking at all of these women?
These are really big, tough questions. Okay. So, I'm gonna the question about democracy and all of these issues, these minority issues. I only highlighted one. It's the focus of my research. And I will say, I first moved and lived in Korea in 2008 for 5 years consecutively, and I went back this year, and I felt the kind of gender conflict, the conflict between genders more than I had ever felt in South Korea, because it's really a big part of the national conversation. And I think you're right in saying that, especially it's among the younger generation that a lot of these things are coming to the fore. I don't have a policy prescription for you. On those issues. It's difficult. As an analyst, I can tell you, I can suggest that it shows right now there's a deeper crisis about what it means to be Korean than just being racially different or from a different national background. It's being a Korean man and being a Korean woman. That's actually a big question, I think, for citizens today and their interactions. As far as the kind of what can we do, and I would never suggest it's on the young people to change. I think I was just saying from an analytically perspective that this group will come into power in the next 20 or 30 years. And so the way they're thinking actually really matters. That's a really equivocating answer, and I'm sorry. But it's not something that I've looked in very deeply. But I think you're right in bringing out the fact that it's this issue of difference. And I think that's actually what motivates my work, is that this issue of difference within South Korean peoplehood is actually deeper, and it's becoming a bigger issue than just the kind of things that get highlighted. And this actually brings me to Nick and Britt's question about how public sees, I guess, ethnic minorities in South Korea and how celebrities play a role in it. I actually think those are really related questions, because there's, I think, two ways of socially, there's other kind of more discourse analysis about the role of South Korean media in displaying difference, like racial or nationality difference. It's not something that I've produced, but I definitely consume it. And there seems to be two different kind of tracks for portraying foreigners in South Korea. The one is, I guess, more positive, and the other is a bit more negative. And I think it intersects with those race, national backgrounds, whether they're co-ethnics or not, educational status. I think all of that's part of the equation. If you think about on the one hand, you have models or pop stars. I mean, there's been like a foreign pop star in so many of the K-pop groups. Mostly, I think, is an economic, like, marketing thing, I think is how it's been explained. And then on the other hand, you have stereotyping of, right now, Chosunjok is a huge part. It's actually the largest group of foreigners living in South Korea, like, period. Not just the workers, but just visas given to any foreigner. That H2 visa is the largest. And so there's a big reticence or conflict among both South Koreans. These are Chinese, but they're us. They're not fully Chinese. They're not fully Korean. And then the Joseonjok themselves, they're not fully Chinese. They're not fully Korean. And there's a lot of circular migration back and forth between China. And they're the ones that are highly stereotyped, not only in news. So if it's a huge group, if a Joseonjok commits a crime, it's national news for weeks. In South Korean movies, there's like a Joseonjok bad guy or gang member or something. It's all in dating. Like, so there's two different narratives, I think, and they're conflicting. And I think it gets to this idea, it's this real big tension between Korea's a developed country and very forward thinking, and we interact with the world, and then still this like hanging on to ethnic, what are the boundaries of us ethnically? And so I think there's a big dissonance there, and I think both of them affect both public and policymakers that I talk to. There are some kind of, I think that kind of a little bit answers the question about the role of celebrities. And there are foreigners who are celebrities too in South Korea, who get a lot of attention mostly for speaking Korean very well, right? And I think that's actually an interesting aspect of like reverse cultural diplomacy, right? It's like showing what foreignness means in Korea. Yeah. But I'm not really sure if that's like the big impetus for change on this issue. I think that there's a lot more on the issue of gender, actually, if the celebrities are doing work. So to draw to other minority rights issues, especially women's issues we've seen in the past 2 years, especially about, the camera, the videotaping, right? A lot of celebrities have been a bit more forward-leaning on that, about, Korea has its own Me Too movement that's largely fueled by celebrities. And so I think that that's a bigger role for them to play. And then to answer very, very briefly, the numbers about foreign bride marriage, it's only for people who are these are all based on visa types. So my research doesn't look at quote unquote illicit or illegal or undocumented migration. It's mostly looking at how the government has planned it. So it's only capturing, this research only captures quote unquote illicit or documented migration.
Any more questions? I'll ask my question from before. In the course of the discussions, you talked about the developmental state and developmentalism, and you mentioned it very briefly in your paper in terms of the transition from the developmental state model with the social contract with the government was very economically focused. And then it seems as if post-developmental state, post-democracy transition, 98 financial crisis, there has been, as you say, there's been a social contract with the government that's a bit more expansive. But at the same time, you also mentioned in your paper, which I would encourage everyone to read, in there you say that the part of the pushback in the Candlelight Movement was the government being unable to provide sort of that economic component of their contract with the government, unable to provide jobs, stability, employment. So I guess through the citizenship question, I know there's been a lot of questions more generally about, are we truly beyond the developmental state? So through the lens of citizenship, does that change give us any more insight into how far we are beyond that model?
Yeah, so on this question of developmental state as it pertains to citizenship, I really follow the work of Seoul National University professor, so he's a sociologist, Chung Kyung-sup, who has theorized this concept of the developmental citizenship. And so I kind of talk about it briefly in my paper. He has theorized that during the developmental era, because of history, right? South Korea was created, and then after the war, developmentalism really was the big impetus of the state social contract, in South Korea, right? It didn't, before that, it was colony and then empire and then kingdom and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so modern citizenship came to be under this, empirical reality of developmentalism under Park Chung-hee. And so he theorizes that, or he explains, and he, backs it up, because he's a good sociologist, that citizenship in South Korea in this time was the social contract, like you said, was based on the state providing for its citizens economically through collusion with, the chaebol, through organizations to provide social welfare provisions, to provide income, and at the same time, as part of the state social contract, the citizens are going to forgo certain rights, and that includes civil rights and political rights. That then were brought to the fore. Those political rights were brought to the fore during democratization. So Professor Chung then says, we're seeing this perhaps he was writing in like 2010, maybe. He published a series of articles that now we're seeing this question at the citizenship level. It's not just like, are we returning the developmental state or post-developmental state? There's other people who will look at particularly social welfare provisions, that shows that perhaps this is a different welfare state model. It's a post-developmental welfare state model. But for citizenship, he suggests that we're seeing South Koreans yearn for a return to developmental citizenship, particularly because of this tension of not being as economically well off as before, right? So issues of employment or economic stagnancy, things like this, have been part of this social contract from before. And so that kind of path, that trajectory of understanding South Korean citizenship has always been there in the background. And so that's informing some of the grievances that South Korean public is bringing to the state today. I don't think that was that wasn't the main thing in the Candlelight Movement, but economic inequality and economic disenfranchisement, particularly with the increase of irregular workers without based on annual contracts or short-term contracts. That's an increasingly large portion of the South Korean labor workforce. And so there's this idea that, well, we're not getting the jobs and we're not benefiting economically like we did before. So it's not yearning for a return to, the developmental era, but it's demanding more from the Korean government. It demands a lot from the Korean government. And the Korean government demands a lot from its people.
Yes. Question over here.
I'm Eugene Kim, an Asan Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. I work with Olivia Inas. Yeah. Okay. And I'm wondering why you try to connect the migrant policies with Candlelight Movement, because I'm an ethnic Korean, and at my perspective, it is true that the success of the Candlelight Movement has deepened our democracy, but it also strengthened our nationalism, I think, because the success made people to think like, oh, no other countries can do it, but we did this. And when people say, oh, we can do everything, we even impeached our president peacefully, then the we doesn't really include migrants or like people from other countries. So I wondered what is your opinion on this?
Eugene, you just like solved this for me. This is great. No, so my point of bringing up the Candlelight Movement was that, internationally, Korea was like really upheld, and I think correctly so, the institutions of procedural democracy work. Like it's a very resilient when it comes to like accountability issues. So there was more of a lead-in to thinking about how is Korea as like a full, again, liberal democracy. That's what Korea wants to be, is liberal is often, that's something that I think is a lot of, like, it's actually jargon, right? To talk about liberal democracy. It's a big talking point among politicians, but like analytically, it's a very important category. Liberal means including civil and minority rights as part of the national agenda. So the reason I brought up the Candlelight Movement was to talk about, the further democratic deepening. Like, where is there still to go? We have this success and others. But you bring up a really important point in that not only was it focused on anti-corruption, but maybe in fact it actually precludes the minority groups that are already making part of South Korean body politic, like South Korean society. And so the question of whether it's made Korea more nationalistic, that's probably an empirical question that we could find the answer out to. But I think you're right in saying that maybe it sets it in a way that precludes the kind of other social movements, just like the democratization movement kind of cut out minority groups, including, women's or feminist groups, like certain worker unions. All of these things were kind of sidelined, but this movement also sidelined some of those things. So you actually make a really good intervention in thinking about how this is thinking about this imagined community in a more nationalist, ethno-nationalist way. Thank you.
Sorry, just wait for the mic for the people on the live stream.
Hi. Could you compare migrant policy in Korea with Japan and the reality of how it's working out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like I said, Korea and Japan are also often compared in the academic literature because, like I said, they have similar political economic structures with strong bureaucracies, a strong ethno-cultural homogeneous narrative, and low rates of immigration. So all of these things would kind of be suggesting a negative, a less likelihood to opening their borders, but they're actually, their treatment of is very divergent. And so I haven't done research in Japan, but my advisor, Erin Chung, who has a book coming out on this next year, I think I cite it and I highly recommend it. She's a political scientist as well. She compares Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. So I'm going to cite her research on this. And she finds that in Japan, a lot of the government policies have happened at the city level. And so that includes labor migration, although Japan's policy recently changed, so they're getting a bit more institutionalized like Korea is, but only this year. They have selective engagement with diaspora, and then, I say selective, because they've also offered incentives for some to go back. And then, because of employment issues, actually. And then I did read, this is actually interesting that when you compare the two, South Korea has found the marriage migrants as a solution, whereas Japan hasn't done that. Japan instead has a lot more, especially local level policies to serve matchmaking between Japanese citizens. And so it's interacting with migration very, very differently, both in terms of who is Japanese and who is not, who is their imagined community, or future new imagined community, which, there's probably less change in that, and that's historically been the case with Japan. But also, if you look at it in more of an institutional level, change in Japan has happened at the city level, the municipal level, whereas in Korea, it's happened at the top down. And then just to kind of throw it in Taiwan, it's happened through the private sector and certain advocacy organizations. So you're seeing actually very differences. And Taiwan's a bit of a different case because it has culturally different populations for over 100 years. But they've handled it quite differently. And so it shows that these aren't, they're neither about adopting international norms, nor are they like a natural progression of policy. Is that sufficient for your, okay.
Okay. I think that's it for questions, and we're almost out of time. Use the remainder of time to give people an opportunity to you a little bit afterwards. But please, I'd ask everyone to join me in thanking Darcie for a great presentation and adept answering your questions.